Okay, so you want to talk about being appointed to the baseball commission?
Yeah, I was, back in '89, I was contacted by Roy Romer, who asked me whether, who was then governor, and asked me whether I'd be a member of the Colorado Baseball Commission. I explained what the attempt was, which was to try to bring a major league team to town. And after very short thought, I said, of course. So, and it was a lot of fun from there. I really enjoyed actually getting to know both of you a bit on that baseball commission. And that is, for posterity here, Neil Macy and Kathy Williams. But somebody who really impressed me on that commission was Sam Supplizio, who I just thought did a remarkable job of leading us. And he had that baseball background. He'd been in the major leagues, and he was scouting now for the major leagues. He ran the JC national JC tournament out in Grand Junction. I mean, he was really good, and I think as a group we worked very well together.
So what do you think inspired you to say yes, and what do you think inspired Roy Romer to ask you?
Oh, let's see. I think that the reason I said yes was because I love sports, and I really do happen to love baseball. I was not a particularly good player in high school because of the way my shoulder is built. But I discovered that because of the way my shoulder is built, I became a fast-pitch softball pitcher. And I pitched in college, I pitched in graduate school, and I pitched in the Navy. And so I really loved the sport. I also found out in the Navy that the Japanese can really play. Because we had a very good team and they defeated us. We went to one town where both the police and the firemen, who had two separate teams, beat us. But anyway, so the sports interest and in particular interest in baseball. I was a track and field guy during that time of the year because I just wasn't a good enough hardball player. But once I learned what I could do with the way my arm was built, it was a whole revelation.
Wow. So I don't want to shortchange your contributions, but we know that you were a major portion of helping acquire or putting together an ownership group.
Right.
When we started, we certainly didn't know whether there was going to be expansion. Then when we did find out there was going to be expansion, we didn't know what the requirements were going to be. Once we found out that a baseball-only stadium would be a requirement, we didn't know what the franchise fee was going to be, or if we would have an ownership group and what the requirements of an ownership group would be. So you want to talk about?
Well, I'd had a background, and that was one of the reasons I'm sure that Roy came and talked to me. I mean, I knew Roy Romer as governor because he had asked me to work with him on a couple of projects, but never anything as intensely as this. But he knew that I had a background in televised sports and in sports because I was in the cable television industry, and I was chairman and CEO of a company called American Television and Communications, which became Time Warner Cable. So he understood all that, and that gave me some understanding of what was going to be required in terms of getting a team. And eventually, we got to a point where the ownership of the team became an issue. And it had always been assumed that John DeCue, who was a very successful local businessman in Denver, and who owned lots of parking lots, was going to, among other things, was going to be the owner. And he had owned the Denver Bears, and I believe the Denver Zephyrs. I think we called them Zephyrs at one point. And John was assumed by everyone, at least, to be the owner, and there were a lot of people in the legislature who assumed that as well. Roy Romer was obviously aware of that, but Roy got word that John's parking lots were underwater financially, and that that the source from which Roy got that information caused Roy to think that the National League would get that information as well. So all of a sudden we had a problem, and we were getting fairly close to selection time. And so Roy asked me if I would go talk to John DeCue to try to talk him out of his position, so that we could open it up to people who might want to be participants. And we did that. I went and talked to John DeCue at a luncheon at Writers Manor, and discussed it in detail with John, the problems that he might or might not have, and the problems that would then cause for our effort to bring a baseball team, a major league team, to Colorado. And John was, I think, struck by what I was talking about, and not happy, and did not agree to withdraw. And I asked him if maybe we could meet for breakfast the next day, the same place, and we could talk some more about it, and he'd think about it overnight. And he was really gracious about it. And if you think about the fact that this man had worked for really decades to be the owner of the major league team, and now he was being asked to step aside by some people who didn't have all of his financials or anything. So, but he did. He agreed. And so we went from that point forward to try to constitute an ownership group. And the governor asked Dick Robinson and Jim Baldwin, who was then the head of King Soopers here, Dick Robinson, obviously Robinson Dairies, and myself, to talk to people who might be owners. And a long list of people were talked to. The Coors, obviously, whose name was eventually going to be on the stadium, and many others. But the easiest and best way to put an ownership group together that would be financially solvent, without any question, seemed to be to get the cable people. So I went around and collected Bob Magnus and Bill Daniels and Gene Schneider, and trying to think of others here who I got into that group. And then I got George Gillette from Vail, who was the owner of Vail, who had an enormous amount of previous pro sports experience. And so we had a really solid group, at which point I got a telephone call from Bobby Brown at the National League saying, who was then president of the National League, saying, "Tryg, that doesn't work. You know why." And I did know why. I didn't think it would come up, but it did. And it all had to do with the fact that Ted Turner had taken his Atlanta Brave franchise, which he had on his own television station in Atlanta, WTBS, Channel 17, and he had taken that and created a superstation, whereby he took all of these rights that he had for Atlanta and basically spread them nationwide. In other words, paid for the rights in a very small area, and was able to sell advertising and gain profits across the nation. That, of course, when he had done that, had made the major league owners furious. And there was a lot of turmoil at that point when Ted did that. All of us as cable operators were very much involved in that, and the National League owners looked at it and said, "We don't want these guys in here." And that seemed reasonable when you think on it. So I said to Bobby, okay, I understand where you're coming from. You get to make the choice of who gets the franchise. We will put together another solid ownership group. And I hope at that point, after having gone through all this, that we will get the franchise for Denver. And in any event, we then set about that. And we talked to a lot of people. We could not put together enough money from Denver to handle the what I'll call the initiation fee and the expenses. I mean, the fee to the National League was about $95 million. And there was another $25 million, I think it was $25 million additional that we had to raise to have our farm system and operating losses for a few years. I'm sort of oversimplifying the numbers there, but that was it. And we couldn't get there, even with a significant debt load that we were willing to take on through banks, probably local banks.
Okay. Denver was in a major recession at that point in time.
Yeah, yeah.
That was the basic local problem.
Yes, it was. It was absolutely was a problem. It hit exactly the wrong time, and among other things, it caused George Gillette to declare bankruptcy, and so he had to drop out. He was a non-cable guy, so he was okay, but he wasn't okay financially. So this was difficult. Once John DeCue pulled back, we were able to get out to the airwaves, in effect, and make it known that we were looking for owners. We weren't sure where we were going to find them, not being able to find enough in Denver, and we decided to go to Aspen and Vail and to look for people who were quite wealthy, had, for example, one of our thoughts was, let's get somebody who has company that has outlets in Colorado, but they don't live here, but they have a place here. And they might very well be interested, particularly if they have a sports background. And some of these people started showing up. There was a fellow named Nicholas from New York, who was a minor league owner, and he got a lot of publicity, but never really was in the game. He was in the press, but not in the game. And then there were these two fellows from Youngstown, Ohio, Mickey Monis, John Antonucci, and they had minor league experience. They had a lot of money because Mickey Monis was the CEO of and a big owner in Farmore stores, PHAR-MOR. And they lived up in Vail, and they came down to one of the meetings. And what we did at these meetings was we had them on the top floor of the Westin Hotel in downtown Denver, and in a penthouse that could only be reached by from the garage with an elevator that went directly to the penthouse. And we met with the group, and we had two meetings within a week, I believe. And we met with a group, we talked to them about what the ground rules are, and actually Roy asked me to tell him what the ground rules were. And it was difficult because it wasn't like other meetings that I'd ever held. And I just said, look, here's the deal. We have X number of days to get this thing put together. We have to be sure of you. And we're going to have to do some things here which will allow us all to understand that whoever is chosen gets chosen, and that other people should not then sprout out on their own and try to create a group, or it's going to cause turmoil and we can't get this thing done in time. So does everybody agree to that? Because if you don't agree to that, then you don't get to come to the second meeting. Okay, so in any event, at the second meeting, the four of us handed out piece of paper to the people who were there, and we said, put on the top the number that you are willing to put up if you are the principal owner. Put on the bottom of the paper, and we creased the paper, put on the bottom of the piece of paper the number that you will put up if you're part of an ownership group, but not the principal owner. And we handed those out to everybody, and then we collected them, and then we looked at each other, and we said, where do we go to count these? We were afraid that some reporters might have gathered out in the hall. They might have gotten wind of it.
You know how they are,
Yeah,
right?
so we said, where do we go? And we finally said, the bathroom. So the four of us went into the bathroom and counted the numbers.
Who are the four of you?
Roy Romer,
Yeah.
Dick Robinson, Jim Baldwin, and myself.
Oh, okay. Those four.
And
Okay.
we counted the numbers, and it was obvious that Monis and Antonucci were the only ones willing to spring high enough to make this thing happen. Because we knew we had some money elsewhere from from Denver
Sure,
people
sure.
who are non-dominant owners, but they are principal owners, but they would play. So we said we can make it work this way. So we talked a little bit about that, and we went out and announced that the winners were Monis and Antonucci. Now, as you all may remember, 2 years later, things sort of fell apart in that regard after an awful lot of work had gone down. In the meantime, I had moved to Providence, Rhode Island to run the Providence Journal Company. And I got a call from Roy at about 2 or 3 in the morning, Providence time, saying, Tryg, we've got a problem. I said, what is it? He said, Mickey Monis is going to be indicted tomorrow morning. Oh my God. He said, we've got to get this thing restructured real fast here. Can you help us? And I said, I'm right in the middle of a huge acquisition that we're doing, and I don't know how much help I can give from here, but I'll certainly make some calls and so on. I was really not much help on that second round, but Dick Robinson and Jim Baldwin and Roy really got out and got the job done on putting that together, getting more money out of the Coors, getting the Montforts more engaged, getting, who's the trucker? McMorris.
McMorris. Jerry McMorris.
Yeah, Orrin Benton.
Linda Alvarado.
Yeah, Linda
Jerry
Alvarado.
Taraji.
Yes, right. Getting that whole group involved, right? And so that was sort of the resuscitation of something that we had done. And I've thought about it a lot since, because people have said, God, don't you feel badly about the fact that you guys picked these, these crooks and I said, no, I don't feel badly at all. And the reason I don't feel badly is because if we hadn't, we would not have had a franchise. That's real simple. But we didn't do it casually. I mean, when we picked them, we had also, between the first meeting and the second meeting, of all the people who were in the room who thought we might be players, we had done a huge amount of background checking on these people. And nobody knew, including the auditors at Farmore, for 2 more years, right, that they had bricks in the warehouse, okay, or some such, because it was a huge fraud that Mickey Monis had perpetrated. But they had brought in people like Paul Jacobs as a lawyer then. They were brought in by a young man named Steve Earhart, wonderful young guy, who really helped get all of that into place. In fact, he called me in Providence and said, Tryg, don't you want tickets? After I'd moved back there. I said, of course I want tickets. And he said, well, by tomorrow we have to know all of the ticket requests from baseball commission, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, well, I guess being back here right now, I'll take 2. And so I got 2 great tickets, as many of the folks did. And I think I had number 33 or something like that. And since I've moved, I was behind the back screen because I had grandkids. and you have to have a screen in front of you when you take them to the game. Anyway, that's sort of the ownership story, I think.
So were you a part of any of the winter meetings or anything like that that went on
You mean
with Major League Baseball?
baseball? No, I was not. I will say this, I did work with Paul Jacobs pretty closely in putting together the presentation to the National League, because I knew he would come over to my house and we'd just sit there and go through stuff. Because I had a pretty good idea of what they were looking for in terms of the finances, the drawing power that we might have, being in sort of a regional franchise as opposed to just a city franchise, and those kinds of things were.
So one of the things that we've heard from several of the individuals who participated in meetings with Major League Baseball, and that
Right.
they're pretty tight-lipped about everything, and it sounds as if perhaps it might have been a benefit that different people were getting different bits of information from different sources, like you getting information from Bobby Brown and
Right.
some others getting information from some other places, that it was enabled you all to put together
Yeah.
a puzzle
Right.
of what they were looking for specifically.
Well, see, I think in some ways, and I always wanted to have a chance, when I had the time to sit down with Sam Simplicio and figure out whether maybe his contact into the National League office, because he knew enough people in baseball, and there were a lot of people who really respected him, might have caused Bobby to call me up, and Sam might have said, well, look, Tryg's doing this thing, okay? Here's that, and Bobby's saying, oh my God, he can't do that, he won't get it, we'd like to have it in Denver, and they may have wanted to have it
very
in Denver.
well could have been, or maybe Bob Hausman too.
Yeah, and exactly. Both those people had the kind of contacts into Major League Baseball to make that happen. Now, as it turned out, a fellow named, oh God, what was his first name? His last name was Baer, B-A-E-R, became, right around that time, became the assistant commissioner of baseball. And he was a guy that I had known very well at Time, because I worked at Time Incorporated back in the day. And he was a big deal at Time Incorporated then. And at that time I was a lot younger, he was a lot older and so on, but he had gone into baseball. And he might have had something to do with it. But my guess is that somebody like Hausman or Sam probably. I wish Sam were around to ask, frankly. What a great guy.
I would agree.
He was
Yeah.
fabulous.
So.
One of the things too that we had heard through the grapevine is that Major League Baseball was looking for local ownership. Was that kind of what prompted you all to go to Vail and try to find people who owned property in Colorado to be a part of the ownership group?
Well, two things did it. One was, yes, they like local ownership, okay, because they believe that those people will have staying power. They'll be embarrassed about it not working. They won't try to move it to someplace. But the other thing was, we just thought that we only had a very short amount of time. And you don't go start talking with some guy in Kansas City or Houston or Miami who might be very wealthy and might want to have a team but isn't in those ownership groups. You don't start talking and get them built up to the point where they really are excited enough about it. We thought that people who already had a Colorado position, maybe home in Colorado, maybe business in Colorado, hopefully both, that would be much better. Plus, there's so much money up there. There are billionaires running around, and there are people who have hundreds and hundreds of millions who frequent the mountains. So we said, we'll just get lists. So we got list after list.
Right. When you were putting together the projections for what kind of attendance might be at the games for the presentation, what kind of numbers were you coming up with?
I'm thinking that the numbers were something like, how you do a high, low, and then expected. I think the low was 20. It was 15. I think the expected was 20 and the high was 25. And we vastly undershot it, obviously. And it was one of the reasons why I didn't have a lot of money at the time, but I had enough so I could have put something, you know, of reasonable significance for me into it. I didn't do it because I just said, it's going to be tight, it's going to be tight. Even though I believed that if it were run absolutely right, you drag in these people from all of the neighboring states. You know, they come from Wyoming and Montana and Nebraska and you know, northern Arizona and, you know, on and on. Utah. I just thought that we could really get a job done there, but I wasn't willing to throw my own money into it.
Well, one of the things that
Too bad.
Yes.
that we had heard from Federico Pena and from Steve Kadish is that Denver was being used in the days prior to the approval of, or the voter approval of building a stadium, of other owners saying, threatening to move the team, their team out of Oakland or their team out of wherever.
Yeah.
Did you all ever think about looking at any of those existing team owners and saying, hey, we've got a stadium here?
No. Some people might have done that. I didn't. And to me, that's fraught with problems when you do that. I mean, so many things can blow that up. This was a much clearer route. Not easy, as it turned out, not easy at all, but much clearer, I thought.
Well, I think that's what makes this such an incredible story. If you think about it, not knowing whether Major League Baseball was going to expand,
Right.
not knowing what the price was going to be, not knowing who our ownership group would be, not knowing if we'd be able to pass a issue to build a stadium.
Exactly.
Not, you know.
Exactly. Yeah.
Lots of unknowns.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as Federico has said, you know, it has mystified many communities across the United States that he's asked to come speak about how did Denver get their act together to make this happen.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think you know, there's some unseen hands here, but also some seen hands. And I think that Roy Romer played a reasonably significant role here, back behind the scenes. And when he chose people like Sam to be the chair of the group, that was really smart, because Sam had a national reputation because of this JC thing that he did out in Grand Junction, right?
Right.
So that was smart, but the people who were on the baseball commission, or the stadium commission, did a really good job of trying to figure out how to get the issue passed. And people like, I think Joe Blake came onto our baseball commission,
Yes.
after all, and Gary Antonoff.
Right.
And those two guys worked really, really hard at trying to figure out how do we get this thing passed, because they had that kind of experience, you know, in the state. I think Joe was Republican county chairman,
right,
at one point. And, those, by the way, a classmate of mine in college.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I think it was one of those fortunate situations where you had some wise heads who were working on this thing, and they got the right people in the right places to try to get it done. You know, Dick Robinson, as part of the ownership, putting the ownership group together, I mean, he was good. He knew everybody.
Yeah, I think that's
You
not
know,
very well.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And everybody trusted him. You know, I mean, that's good. So, I just, let me see if I had.
Some more on your notes?
Yeah, well, it was just a note that I sent you all. No, I think I told you about that.
So if you had it to do over
Yeah.
again, would you do anything differently?
Yeah, if I had it to do over again and I had more time, because I was extraordinarily busy at the time, running a company, but I would have, spent more time going back to the governor and asking him, okay, you asked that, let's talk about that longer. I think you discover the older you get how important it is to really bore into things. Because, as we've all talked, we each had a very important role in this thing. But there was a heck of a lot of other stuff going on that we weren't necessarily at the center of.
Right.
And when that happens, if you said to yourself later, what would I change? I'd try to learn more about the other pieces. And I think one of the places where one might have learned more about the other pieces was to talk to Roy or to talk to Federico, for example. I got Federico to come on the board at DU. Now, he's now dropped off the board because of the Wells Fargo situation. But he's one of the great people, really outstanding. And
Yes.
Wow. I'm just trying to think if anything.
Any final thoughts, or?
I don't have anything. I can call you if I have any others.
Okay.
But I think that gives you a sense. I think that whole ownership thing from John DeQ right through was.
Well, that was a key piece, because if
Yeah.
that hadn't happened, if we
Yeah.
hadn't come up with anybody, we would have been out of luck.
Right. And I got to liking Paul Jacobs a lot. And he went out to San Diego and basically helped them get their act together in that stadium. When they moved the stadium,
Right.
brought it into town, and I used to take the kids out there. I lived out there in Delmar, and I used to take the kids out there to watch the Padres. But that was the old stadium. And then he went and they built this spectacular thing in town.
Well, I know many areas have used this same structure that we put together
You mean
in their community.
the organizational structure? You mean? Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Have used it as a template. Mhm.
Yeah. No, I think it was really wise, very wisely done, and I'm quite happy I had nothing to do with that.
Oh, wow.
I mean,
Say
with
that.
with putting that structure together. That structure was well thought out by the people who thought it out.
And so if you had it to do over again, you think baseball's been good for Colorado?
Oh, it's been phenomenal. I mean, look what it did to Lodo. Unbelievable. But it's done more than that. I mean, people come into town, watch a couple of games, go up to the mountains. I mean, I think from the economy of Colorado standpoint, it's fabulous. And I think that, I happen to think that Denver Art Museum is fabulous too. We get shows that people come from all over the world to see. But certainly from all over the country, they come to see the Rockies, see some games, and everybody's heard about Coors Field, and if the team recovers from its recent slump, which it will.
We know it's temporary, right?
Yeah, of course it's temporary, right? Gray and who's our other pitcher who just had testicular cancer? Anyway, who's coming back?
Yeah, well, it's really had a jump start in terms of the Lodo and the economy in downtown. I mean, it's brought so much more energy in.
It's a pleasure to go down there. It really, in my view, in many ways, it accentuated the different neighborhoods of Denver. Because before that, yes, we had some different neighborhoods, but nobody really thought about them or cared about them, or and all of a sudden, go down to Lodo, they got some great restaurants, right? And now all of a sudden you can go up into the Highlands and Lohi, and you go all the way around the city, and there are these various places that people speak about all the time. Stapleton. I mean, a lot of development happened and people got excited about it, so they travel around town. They don't just stay in their own neighborhood. And I think, frankly, that this action in Lodo really was something that invigorated all of that.
Well, even though there were 3 locations, I happen to think that it wouldn't have been my choice, but it ended up, I think, being the best choice because they kept the historic characteristics of a ballpark. The neighborhood still has that historic characteristic, and I think, and Union Station, I think, demonstrates the same kind of thing, that people enjoy being down there in the public space.
Yes, yes, absolutely. No, I think it's, I think we should all be proud that we were a part of this thing. I really do.
Exactly.
Well, and I know Neil and I are both amazed every time we start listening to the stories and how many obstacles were in the way, but we got them solved somehow by working together. And it worries me that politics maybe isn't, I don't know, maybe you couldn't replicate what was done back then today with the political environment that we have.
Well, it'd be harder for sure. Sure. I mean, the chasm is so great. But I think about putting that ownership group together. That all happened from the time that John DeQ agreed to leave through to putting the ownership group together. That all happened in just a few weeks.
Well, and I
I
think
mean, it was unbelievable. But that was all the time we had.
Right.
Because the assumption right up till then was DeQ was going to do it, and he had the money, and bingo.
it was the same. It seemed like it took them forever to decide that there was going to be an expansion team, but once they decided there was going to be 2 teams, I know we had to carry legislation at the 11th hour to put it on the primary ballot because the schedule had been accelerated. We couldn't wait for a general election.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
No.
Well,
that's
Tryg,
great,
thank you
Tryg.
for
Thank
your
you very much. That was
contribution.
fantastic.
Thank you for coming by. You guys are doing the Lord's work here.
Well, I tell you, I mean, a lot of what you said, I certainly didn't have any idea of, and it definitely is a story worth having people hear.
Yeah.
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 Well, thank you, Tryg.
Well, thank you. I had